Hello, and welcome to Lab Roots, the Life of Her Mind, an interview series devoted to learning how women think about their research, their field, and their future. Let's get started. Today, we are in conversation with Tomi Akingbade, founder of the Black Women in Science Network and a Ph.D. student in neurochemistry at the University of Cambridge. Oh my goodness. Tomi's scientific research centers on the inflammatory mechanisms of aggregates in Alzheimer's disease. Interested in science since childhood, Tomi founded the Black Women in Science Network as a response to the lack of frank conversations, probably any conversations, about being a Black woman in science and the supportive community such conversations generate. The image of what it is to be a scientist is changing and must continue to do so if the sciences are to achieve a comprehensive understanding of nature. So getting to chat a bit with Tomi is one way to help us do that. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today and giving us a bit of a glimpse into the life of your mind.
No, thank you for having me. It's honestly a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you. So my first question is about us getting to know a bit about you. How did you find your way to neuroscience and then specifically neurochemistry with the specialization in Alzheimer's research?
Yeah, so neuroscience, my journey to neuroscience it's not necessarily a weird one, but unfortunately I don't have the kind of thing where I knew from the age of 4 that I wanted to be into neuroscience because I didn't know what neuroscience was at the age of 4. So what I can say is that I studied biology at GCSEs, which in the UK, I guess, is that bit that you go to before you go to kind of your senior years of secondary education. And there was this one page in the book about the brain, and it was one page out of maybe 200 pages in the module about the brain. And I was just like fascinated by it. And I kind of was going through school in terms of, like I can do it, which I was very blessed to be able to do it. But then I found this page and I was like, oh, this is what it means when people have a passion about something. This is what it means to be excited to learn something. And I kept going back to that page. Whenever I'd revise, I'd be on that page for ages, just thinking about things. And I wanted to know more. And it was one of the first times that I'd generally wanted to know more. I'm curious by nature. So I'd always had curiosity in various different topics, even topics that I wasn't good at. But this one I felt a bit different. So not really knowing anything about it. So I did my exams, put that aside, went on to do my A-levels, which is the 2 years before you go to university or college. And I kind of forgot about that page because it never came up again. And then it came to the time where I had to apply for universities. And I could see people being really passionate about things and wanting to do things. And I was still quite lucky in terms of I could do quite a few things. Like I could have gone into finance or various different subjects. But then for some reason, I remember that page and I was like, I want to study that page. I wonder if it's possible to study that page. And I looked into it a little bit more and I realized that neuroscience was a thing and I could do that one page for an entire degree and possibly for the rest of my life. I was like, okay, sign me up. So there aren't many neuroscience straight degrees. There are a lot of courses that do biology, then you specialize in neuroscience at the end of the year. But I knew I didn't want to do biology. I wanted to do neuroscience. So that's how I found out about neuroscience. So I did the degree. I always say that I hated my degree, but I loved the subject in terms of I hated exams. I did not like exams. I did not like having to do coursework. But I could have sat in those lectures for years. Like I could happily have sat in lectures over and over again. I found it so interesting. And I decided when I started doing the research that I love the research and I wanted to go into further study and to do a PhD. The path to PhD wasn't seamless, which I'm sure we might talk about later on. But I came across the lab that I'm doing my PhD in now, and I have two supervisors. I have a supervisor that is a professor in innate immunology, and then I have someone who is a specialist in imaging, protein imaging. And in biophysical chemistry and protein imaging. So their roles combined have formed a project that is looking at the neurochemistry of aggregates in Alzheimer's disease. And I'm looking specifically at the kind of epigenetic modifications that happen over the course of Alzheimer's disease. So that's how I've found myself in neuroscience. Just it started from a page in a biology handbook, and then it's summoned to doing a PhD at the University of Cambridge. I'm just as confused as to everyone else how this happened.
You mentioned elsewhere that you did not go straight from your undergraduate career to your graduate career. You how did that come about? What have been the benefits, do you think, of taking a little bit of a break and working either in your area or adjacent to your area before entering the PhD program?
Well, I have to confess and be honest, it wasn't intentional to take a break. I wanted that straightforward path of finish, PhD, and then get out into the working world before I'm 25. Did not happen that way due to many things. I think I will say hands up, a lack of knowledge into what it takes to apply to a PhD and how to apply to one and where to look and what a PhD really is. And also just the market of the nature of the world. Like I needed to do a funded PhD. There was no way I could fund it myself. So I wouldn't say there's a lack of opportunities for funding, but there's more people at the time when I was applying, there were more people than there were funded places. So there was a combination of that. And just to give people context, I graduated and then I was unemployed for about 6-7 months looking for a job just adjacent to science or just something similar to science. And eventually I found a job in a medical laboratory associated with the NHS, our National Healthcare Service. And I was working in a virology centre and I started that job in February 2020. And a month into that job, it became a COVID testing lab. Yeah, everyone knows. Every time you say 2020, everyone's like, oh God, we know what happened next. So by March 2020, we were a full-blown COVID testing lab, and I was there for the rest of the year. So a complete accident, but that's where I ended up. And then after about 9 months working there, I ended up working at another lab at the UK Dementia Research Institute, one of their centres in London. And I worked there for a while and then moved on to my PhD eventually. And I have to say that I didn't the journey to PhD, I did not do it alone. So many people advocated and helped for me and were like screaming and shouting at institutions like, how could she not have a PhD? Why wouldn't you let her in? On social media and various things like that. So I thank all of them for the fact that I'm able to be doing a PhD right now. But having said all of that, even though it wasn't intentional, there are definitely benefits. I'm a little bit older. I'm a little bit wiser. I've seen research and it only affirmed to me that I definitely did want to do a PhD. Having to had fight for it, even though I don't think anyone should have to fight for education, having to have fought for it, I do value it so much more than I would have if I just walked straight into it. I also think like I've been able to gain various experience. I know a bit more what I like and what I don't like. And I just have that bit more knowledge. So some things are just quicker for me to learn than they are for other people who may have never had the experiences that I've had. So I've had a lot of warm-up time before starting the PhD, which is fine. Also to say, those who do go straight into PhD, nothing wrong with that. Both sides. There are perks to both sides.
And so it sounds like, apart from what you just said about people around you directly or from afar saying, hey, you need to have your PhD, it sounds like prior to that, at least in your undergraduate career, there wasn't much in the way of kind of support and, sort of, helping you as an undergraduate think about what could be available to you. Like I oftentimes will, ask people what they're interested in, et cetera, et cetera. And it's amazing. And I mean, I was like this myself. I think we're all like this, but I'm reminded, people don't know unless you share with them what possible career paths there are. So, but was there not much in the way of, I guess, mentoring in your undergrad program?
So I would say, it's difficult for me to give there wasn't this conclusively. I can only kind of give my experience. So I can tell you for a fact on paper, they definitely did have lectures that said, there are the options to do a PhD, there are options to do this. When they were given those lectures, I think the key thing for me was that I was already bamboozled by the fact that I was at university, that I couldn't really think beyond that. So, and when they were presenting these opportunities, there was the voice of my brain was like, this is what worked for them. It may not work for people who look like you, because I didn't see anyone who looks like me given these messages. So I was like, okay, great. Like you are giving this advice to people. But is it for me? because a lot of the access to education had not been tailored to me, or hadn't thought about me being included in that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the opportunities they were saying were you required, for instance, placements or experience. I was not in a position to do unpaid placements, which is what they usually were at the time that I was studying.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, you're not talking to me when you're saying these opportunities are available. So I think there was an element of that. So as much as there was the kind of general mentoring. It wasn't until I got very specific guided mentoring, and like to people who I still very proudly call my mentors today. It wasn't until they were advocating for me and telling me that you, Tomi, you can do this.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until I was like, oh, okay, maybe I can do this. And I would say I went on a research placement year during my degree, which wasn't encouraged by my lecturers, but it was encouraged by other people. I went on that placement year, and it was in that placement year that it rebuilt up my confidence in the fact that I could be a researcher and I could be a scientist, and I had to be in it to see it. And again, those people were mentors to me for that year and showed me that there was space in science for me. They didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't say it would be easy. I got to see the reality of what it was like. And I said, okay, I'm making an informed decision in the fact that I want to stay in science and use my skills in this field of research.
Mm-hmm. Is one as you're speaking, I'm thinking partly of so I hope this will make sense and not take up too much time, but so on the one hand, we understand the scientific enterprise as, involving expanding our empirical knowledge, right? And since empirical knowledge is effectively, contingent and limited by each, individual, it would seem to make sense that you would want to have, as many varied experiences in the mix, right, as possible. And yet, obviously, historically, whether we're talking about the US or the UK, right, in the sciences, that's not the case, right? Scientists tend to look a very specific way, and the default inference, whether it's unreasonable or not, is that, oh, I don't look like that, so I don't get to do it. Is that something like what you're talking about, having experienced yourself, that it's not that people weren't, good educators and all the rest of it, but there wasn't this idea, hey, this person might not realize because we look different that, us looking different shouldn't be relevant to whether or not they can do this work.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. Like, I can't say there was an active, it's you that can't do this, it's you that can't do this. I think it was a case of there wasn't the encouragement that, like, no, we do want people like you to be doing this. And we need people who have your background and have a different background from the lecturer's point of view, looking around at us and saying, from different backgrounds for myself, to be doing this. And yeah, I think it was a case that I needed to be pulled aside to be like, you can do this, like, you can do that. And I didn't get that. I don't really blame the lecturers anymore. I think at a time I was quite angry and just felt let down because my peers were just flying and just like seemed to have such an easy experience. But I think now that a lot of people are speaking more and saying no, that like it's not a case of you need to just quietly accept people. You do need to quite vocally accept people and just say, like, look, I know there are differences in this room and that we've all come from different backgrounds, but that makes you a better scientist, if anything.
So am I right to think that it was when you went into the lab, you left school, you went to work, that you began to, for lack of a better word, you began to see where you fit in and why that was the case? Can you say a little bit more about how that happened?
Yes, sure. So it was a sandwich year. So I did my first and second year of university, and then you had to find, if you found a placement, you could go ahead and go and do a placement. So you had to seek out yourself. So it was, because it wasn't mandatory, it was a little bit harder because you literally had to reach out to professors and say, hey, can I spend a year with you? So I did that. I reached out to a person, and for the fact that someone said yes, I was already a bit like, oh, okay, you're saying yes to me. This is weird. Like, why would you want me to come and be in your lab? I went and I was treated as a scientist. And I think that's the first time I felt like I was a scientist. And I think it was a case for me where I didn't have any peers, so I was almost and I sat in an office with with PhD students whilst I was literally I had no degrees at this point. And I was just, my thoughts were taken and considered important. And it was like, yeah, you have views, we want to hear it. And I think that's when it was a case of like, oh, my brain is valuable and I can add something to scientific research. And I think that was the first time I think it might have taken me being removed from my peers or being removed from a situation where I was kind of always the student and just the student that's being taught by the lecturer. I was now the student that is informing the lecturer, like, we should do this research, we should do that. So I think being given some individualism and some almost respect to my mind, it was a case that I was like, okay, I can do this science thing. And that definitely transformed my thinking. And it was the first time that I felt like I could say I was a scientist.
Now, as you're so how close are you to finishing?
So to finishing my PhD, so I am a year and almost 6 months in. So I technically have 2 years left. It's very daunting to say that, and it does not feel like it. So I'm approaching halfway. So I'm definitely still early on, but I'm approaching halfway.
Oh, but given what's been going on, the past few years, like you said earlier, starting in March 2020, that's a huge accomplishment. When you began your program, had people come back into the physical lab, or did you have to begin online?
So my program officially started October 2021. Yes, that's right. So it officially started October 2021. And it was, sorry, I said that wrong. What year did it? Yes, October 2021. Yes, my program officially started October 2021. So the physical world was open, but we were cautious. So we still had face masks. Mm-hmm. Also, my lab is based in a hospital. So there's the added kind of thing of that, right? So it was still face masks, and it was work if essential. So you still had a lot of people working predominantly at home. Mm-hmm. And especially based on the college system that the University of Cambridge has, there was this sense of a lot of people live in the places that they're studying. So there was kind of this blurred line of, we need to be super cautious, but we also kind of need to get back to life happening. Mm-hmm. So it was definitely still, I would say it was open but restricted. Mm-hmm. And then we were teased out of it very slowly, I think, towards the middle of my first year. And I think that's when we started kind of walking around without face masks in certain areas and kind of easing back into it. So there was that return. So I believe I got the kind of like the remnants of the heavy lockdowns and I don't want to say peak of the pandemic because it doesn't work like that. But we were getting used to being a pandemic. So I got to that stage where we were transitioning almost out of the shock waves of it, but we were more becoming like, this might be a normal for a lot longer. So I did have the remnants of that and had the side effects from that, but I definitely can't say I was one of those years that was heavily affected. Like, I know some people's PhDs, majority of it was in lockdown.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so if you started in 2021, you had already got several years of the Black Women in Science network going. So there's you have already done so much. As I like, where to begin? Podcast, events, right? But so it's probably best if you tell the story. Sure. How long did you want to start an organization? What are the key features of the organization? Mm-hmm. Yes, you're based in the UK, but are you planning on, let's say, chapters or spreading out into other countries?
Mm-hmm. So direct me on this story because I can go on many tangents because it has been a wild journey. But yes, the Black Women in Science Network, I started in 2018. And that is when I was on that placement year doing research and the first time I felt like a scientist. Because that was the first time I started thinking about whether I could have a job in science or what a life in science would look like. And when I looked, I again didn't see myself. So I kind of was looking around and trying to ask certain questions that were related to being Black and a woman in science. And there was no one to ask that question to in my immediate vicinity. As much as the people that I had were very clued up and they knew what was going on in the world, they didn't have the same background that I did. And they could relate to it on various different things. It was a very diverse environment. However, there was no other Black women in that I could speak to. So in reaching out to people, I spoke to other Black women in science who my peers usually, and they felt the exact same way. So I was a bit concerned. I was like, why are we all struggling in silence? We're all always the only ones in our departments. So I kind of didn't wait to answer your question to start it. I just realized, I said, I need to meet these people. They need to meet me. We have questions that aren't being answered and we're just everywhere. And Twitter was almost too big of a space, like social media platforms were too big of a space to find each other. So I created a space outside of all of those platforms in which we could exist and share with each other. So I started it pretty much immediately as soon as I felt that I had the need for it, because I knew I wasn't the only one struggling. And then it's kind of grown since there. So that was in 2018, and it's kind of grown since there. And yes, I'm based in the UK, so it is more so based as a UK organization. However, we do have worldwide reach at the moment because, as people in science know, we move around a lot. So, and we're not really held down too much by a physical location. So, and most of the things we do have a virtual capacity to it. And because majority of our existence has been in a pandemic, most of our stuff is online, so we're an online platform and we do exist worldwide. And I would love for us to touch soil, touch American soil, touch worldwide soil, because as much as there are differences, of course, in physical location and the experiences that Black women would have around the world, there is this unity and community that we can form despite those physical differences. And it would be great to take it worldwide. We just need someone to help us get there, but we'd be willing to go worldwide. And I think that's a key thing that we're trying to do, is to kind of decentralize science a little bit. And because the more we put down these physical barriers, which are necessary sometimes, but the more we enforce them when they aren't necessary, the more we kind of limit ourselves from reaching out to as many people as possible. And I want to make sure that every Black woman in the world feels that they can do science if they want to.
So is it the case that when you say that you're looking for basically an opening to spread, is it a matter of funding, or sort of not, I don't know if I should say venues in other countries, like, or maybe, let's say, connecting with a working scientist in another country who wants to host events in that country or in that city? How, like, what does that look like, that when you think about it spreading?
Yeah. So I think what it looks like is, we have multiple different aims. So I should say the kind of strapline, our slogan is a space, a platform, a movement. So a space being we create private spaces and safe spaces for Black women to come and share their understanding and to just be themselves and just offload and feel recharged. A platform in which we believe that we amplify the voices. So we don't actually create narratives, we just amplify the narratives of Black women for them, and because we have the privilege of being in spaces that they may never be able to enter, so we just amplify their voices. And we also want to be a platform that raises up the individual Black women in science, and a movement in terms of, we want to change the narrative and just not kind of just exist on the sidelines. We want to come back into the wider world and just say, look, this needs to change, and like create change and progress. So yes, I think it is the case that anyone who wants to fund that, because we are a non-profit organization, all of our events are free. We don't charge for anything, again, to remove that barrier to access. Mm-hmm. It is a case of funding. It's a case of funding, I guess, to get us over there and to hold us and host us and to create spaces that Black women deserve. And it is support as well. So that could be, whether it's space, venues, it's people advocating for us and sharing that we exist on multiple different platforms and sending people our way and kind of just giving us that credibility in different spaces in which people have not heard of us before. So I think it is that it's a multitude of things, and there are so many people who can help us. And we are very lucky, and we've been very lucky, and we only exist now because of so many generous people. For instance, the entire network has been run by volunteers, and they generously give up their time and their time and expertise to various different things. So there's so many different ways in which that an expansion worldwide could happen. But yeah, those are just a few of the ways that could work.
And I noticed, so for example, when I was looking at the website and specifically at the podcast, I was struck by the fact that the podcast episodes weren't aimed exclusively at Black women scientists working in the sciences, but also at just any Black woman and concerns that have to do with being a Black woman today, regardless of where you are. And so I'm wondering if, I'm not quite sure how to pose the question, but I think it has something to do with how your network, the scope of the network goes beyond, scientific research and working in science. Is that?
Yes, absolutely. Because I think it is a case that when we do get Black women who are in science together, so many different things come up. It's like, yes, we all have an interest in science, but we are also Black and women. So we have multiple different things that we experience in life based on the different groups that we exist within. So, and it is a case as well that we have the reason of this first season of the Black Women in Science Network podcast was Black Women's Health, is because there were so many conversations. And I realized that because we work in sciences and a lot of our sciences are related to healthcare, we have this ability, we have the nuance and the privilege of having the knowledge of science and how it works and how healthcare is impacted by sciences, and also having the lived experience of being the Black women. And it's a conversation that has been happening because we brought in so many people who were having the conversations, but it just wasn't happening on a big enough platform for me. And it wasn't in a space that it was collated and it was easy to access for everyone. So the podcast kind of speaks to that in the terms of it's a space where so many women from so many different disciplines are able to have a conversation about healthcare. And for me, it was about opening up the floor to people who aren't traditionally scientists, because again, right now it is a privilege to be a scientist. The pathway to be a senior scientist it's laced in having had so much privilege and so many things handed to you. That means that a lot of people who do have the knowledge and the ability to be scientists are not scientists. So whilst I believe that the accreditation does deserve credit, there are so many people that have an insight and the ability to think in such a critical way, but they just will not be afforded the title based on their background, what they look like and their previous life experiences. So we wanted to kind of remove that need for someone to be a professor or anyone senior in this scientific field to have a voice in that conversation and open that floor and really value the lived experience and the personal research and the individual research that people have done into different versions of healthcare. So that was kind of how that was birthed. And it was, again, just looking, I think as a network, we looked at ourselves and said, we are so lucky to be able to have studies. I say lucky is probably not the right word. We have somehow managed to be able to stay in it with the science game. And there's a way that we're able to approach questions that are really impacting our community, and we should feed that knowledge back into our community, because they're usually looked at from a white lens, or a westernized white lens. They're usually looked at in that way, and those aren't the lenses that we're able to see through at the same time. So that was the main reason for that podcast and why it was done the way it was done for the first season.
Well, one of the things that I find so exciting about just the existence of the organization and the network and its work is this idea that there's so much that, let's say, somebody like me doesn't see because of my particular embodiment. And even if I don't have the same lived experience, if I don't know about it, or I'm not curious enough to ask about it, right, then the lived experience that's not mine kind of disappears. And just selfishly, that's bad for me, because I then know less. I'm more ignorant than I would be if I were to know about this another person's, experience. And so I was thinking about, you talked about the network being birthed, and I was thinking about in the US, stories that have only slowly and more increasingly come to light about, for example, Black women dying during the pregnancy process or in childbirth. Why is that? And why weren't we paying attention to it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you talk about having a space and a space that allows also for the amplification of voices, which then presumably generates at least an awareness on the part of people who aren't Black women, right, can also lead towards some sort of change. And I'm wondering, all this said, what you think about progress. So I was thinking about this movie, Hidden Figures. It's about this in the, I think at Langley in the early 1960s, there were Black women mathematicians. And this movie was about how these women sort of became real voices in, I know it's a complicated story, but real voices in the work of some really important projects. And I'm at an age where I think, okay, so it's the early 1960s. Here we are in 2023. And stuff that I thought we were done with when I was a kid in the 1980s comes up again. And I'm thinking, gosh, I'm a dum-dum. I thought, oh, we're done with this. And I'm so wrong. So all this to say, like, how do you sort of envision a future in which this conversation is really just an historical artifact?
I mean, I would love that to be the future. I would love that if that's the change that we've had. But I think, as you've said, history is not even repeating itself. I think it's repackaged itself. It's just repackaged itself. I think it is. A lot of the struggles have just been repackaged. I'm sure people who were around in the 60s, 80s would say that progress has been made, which is fair. I think that overtly things like the overt layer of it has changed and it probably has reduced in some way. But then there's some ways that the racial aggression has been repackaged, for instance, microaggressions. And I think that I hope that we continue to progress. That's what I'm saying. I hope that we don't get stagnant. That would be something that's terrible. But I do hope that there's progress. I would love it if in the future that my future kids, they're like, racism, what's that? But I'm not sure if we can undo centuries of aggression and misfortune in that short period of time. I really do hope progress is there. And I think progress for me looks like this conversation happening less and people thinking, oh, it's not that bad anymore. I do hope that in 10 years people listen to this conversation and be like, that is not a thing that I experienced. That would be my dream. And that is progress. But I think if any of us are looking for the removal of any sort of challenges that you face as a Black person in our lifetimes, we probably don't understand the extent of the experience of Black people currently.
Mm-hmm. My goodness. I think that's well, it's partly heartening, partly not so heartening to think that we're not going to, and maybe in our lifetimes, get past where we are. But yeah, I when you, among a number of things that struck me about what you just said was this idea that we don't just think that we've gotten past a certain point because we're not seeing other people's experiences and events, but that it's actually the case, right? And I think about that in terms of what I thought when I was younger, and even as an adult, namely, oh, I'm not seeing certain things, so we must be okay. And it didn't occur to me to ask, well, just because I think that's okay, or just because I think we must be okay because I'm not seeing X, Y, and Z, does that mean it really is, or I'm just not, seeing it? Who do I need to ask about their experiences? Which I think brings us back again to the project of science, right? As this expanding body of knowledge that, yes, adheres to certain methodologies and principles and so forth, but ultimately relies on the robust diversity of voices and experiences to proceed. So, for example, you mentioned earlier that it was that when you were treated as a scientist, you thought of yourself as a scientist for the first time, and you were encouraged to share your thinking, which reveals a lot of the creativity at the heart of really good scientific
Yeah.
research. Where does your scientific creativity come from? Does that question make sense?
Oh, yes. No, yes, it does. I think there's an element for me of natural curiosity. I was always that kid who asked why. I always wanted to know, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And then I'd be answered like, no, but why? Like, I just always wanted to know the reasoning of why. So I think that's part of my curiosity. I think a second part of my curiosity has stemmed from the fact that I realized that we don't all see the world in the same way. So I'm just, even that question of, is your blue my blue? Do we all see the same thing? And like, what is definitive and how do we answer that question? I think my creativity comes from the fact that I've been empowered by multiple people now to believe that I have a unique sense of thinking. So that allows me to dive deep into it and to just have the confidence in that what I'm thinking could be true and it is valuable. And I would say that's where my creativity stems from, because I think everyone has the capacity to be it. They just need to be given the room to be it. And I've just been blessed to have been given the room and platform to be creative. I think it's similar to, maybe artists will hate that I say this, but I would say it's similar to art in terms of, yes, you can have people who aren't the best kind of traditional dancers, but are they who decides who's a good dancer? As in, there's no wrong way to have creative thinking with insights. And I do think that we have to be able to kind of visually, and we have to imagine, you have to let your mind roam if you want to do research science. And who is to say what's bad and good? Yes, there are moral boundaries that we should obey and stick to. But in terms of thinking and trying to dive deeper into something and trying to find something new that doesn't exist, you do have to be creative in that element. And yeah, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. It is a case of being afforded the space and the being encouraged that you do have something valuable to add to a space.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your time and sharing your story. And I'm very excited about the Black Women in Science Network expanding until it's around the globe. Yeah, I wish you the best of success and hope to be able to support you in that effort.
No, that's amazing. Thank you so much for having me. It's honestly been a huge pleasure speaking to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I will look forward, I hope, to following up with you again in the future.